Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. Today I'm going to be covering this book, The Orc King by R.A. Salvatore. Now, I want to preface this with some context. Ordinarily I show the cover, but this book I have had for, 13 years this summer. It's been around the block and across multiple moves. I've brought it to school, I've brought it to camps with me, to working at camps with me. So the cover eventually had scotch tape holding it together, and at this point is just gone. So I have the spine of this book. I bought this book at a Goodwill store in 2010, and over the course of one very tragic week I finished it. And very tragic, I mean, my family had a double funeral, an uncle and a grandfather, and between buying this book and going to those funerals, there were 5 days. There were, road trips from my cousin's place to Baltimore Washington International Airport, and from there a plane flight to New Mexico. And so I had a lot of time to read this book, and in the years since I've reread it a lot. Now, The Orc King is part of a trilogy, but most of the books in the Drizzt Do'Urden series are or were purchased new. I bought them at a Borders or a Barnes & Nobles or a Books-A-Million, places like that. And so the other two books in this trilogy bought new. A lot of the books in the series bought new. But the Orc King and then the first two trilogies in the series, the Dark Elf trilogy and then the trilogy starting with Crystal Shard, those are part of this story, so to speak. So the Orc King is about Drizzt Do'Urden. It's pretty far into his series, and it picks up where a previous trilogy left off, but in a weird way. This technically seems like it doesn't fit the timeline in the right way. The trilogy that came before this one was about King Obold, an orc, invading the north and attempting to found his own kingdom, a surface world kingdom of orcs, among the first of its kind, and certainly the first of its kind within the sphere of influence of the Sword Coast. What makes this book really interesting is that the trilogy before this ends with a reunion. So Drizzt Do'Urden is cut off from the rest of his friends. One of his friends is left in a coma. And at the end of that trilogy, they're alive and they're together again, and they're determined to weather this storm and to push back the orcs. So this book opens with Drizzt Do'Urden and an elf ally of his stopping some adventurers, people that are in the area of the Kingdom of Many Arrows, which is the orc kingdom that Obold sets up. They are there trying to kill orcs. Effectively, the orc kingdom is, for the most part, peaceful. Well, not peaceful, but an uneasy truce along its borders. There's distrust between the neighbors, but they're still neighbors. At least that's what this book implies. And the adventurers in the opening story, the opening prologue, are effectively terrorists. They are there to kill orcs that are, in theory, members of a nation at peace with its neighbors. And then, after defeating these adventurers, Drizzt Do'Urden and his elf ally kind of reminisce. And so it frames it kind of in the way that a lot of clip show episodes work. I mean, it uses that narrative foundation, but then it uses memories that we as readers don't recall, but they as characters do. So that's a lot of context for this book, and I kind of spoiled it. So in this book, or rather, at the end of the previous trilogy, winter begins to settle in, and the orcs set up more permanent villages and camps so that they can survive in the very frigid winter of the north, in the spine of the realms. And during that time, there are no new advances along the battle lines. And an orc clan comes to the surface, one with a lot of ogres in its midst, as well as some orogs, which, as this book describes, are half orc, half ogres. And with this mixed race tribe comes a immense orc leader who is of the mind that orcs should only be shock troops that they just ram into the enemy and they win or they die. There is no retreating, there is no tactics, there is only go in and slaughter. And so he renews the hostility. And the leader's name is Grguch, spelled Grguch. Pretty quickly, they begin to fight along the borders of these kingdoms and try to renew the war. Obold, for his part, wants to settle a kingdom. He wants to settle down and make a home for the orcs on the surface. And so he is at odds with Grguch. And both sides have their sway. A lot of orcs were lured to the surface in the hopes that they would just kill as many elves, dwarves, humans that they could. And Obold and several tribes allied with him were privy to the knowledge that what they were doing was expanding their realm of influence, expanding outwards from the mountains so that they could live on the surface in peace. And so these two sides are competing, and there's a couple movements going on. The trilogy before this and then the Orc King are about this war. Obold moves forward with frost giants, who by this point in the Orc King have retreated back to their realm, effectively at a major loss. And the trolls to the south, trolls in Dungeons and Dragons being infinitely regenerating creatures with one weakness, that if they touch flames or fire, they will burn. Any injury that is burned will not regenerate, and they can permanently die only from fire and acid. And so the trolls at this point have been put down, the giants have retreated, and the orcs remain. And the various sides of the conflict have their own interests. The human trade settlements on the surface just want to have the war end. They don't want a prolonged conflict. The dwarven kingdoms are willing to engage in prolonged conflict if the humans from those larger trade cities are willing to back them up. Obold doesn't want further war, and he wants to end this threat, the threat of Grguch, who is a rival leader within his land. And Grguch just wants to kill everything he can find. And so these different sides meet in battle, and ultimately the humans, led by a major character in the Forgotten Realms, Lady Illustriel, she insists on restraint. And Drizzt's allies and his king, Braenor Battlehammer, insists that these orcs, Grguch is not an exception, he is a sign of what's to come. But Drizzt Do'Urden is willing to not necessarily have mercy, but give these orcs a chance. And he goes out there, he does mourn some friends lost in the previous trilogy. He captures a dark elf that he had encountered in the previous trilogy. And all these different paths lead together where Gurgutch and Obold are fighting. And Drizzt ends up, to his amazement, helping Obold, because Obold is at least a force for order. It may be a malevolent force in the area, but at least it is one that will work with the neighbors to make something new and potentially good. And all of this is kind of the A plot, and the B plot is that a dwarven settlement has been discovered in the previous trilogy, and they are exploring it, and they find, and by they I mean Raynor Battlehammer and his kingdom, sends out some dwarves to explore this region, this lost city. And what they find is a lost city where some orcs at some point in time were at peace with dwarves in the area. And the more they research it, the more they realize this lasted for generations. They don't know what brought the end to this community, but they know that in the past, these orcs and these dwarves were comrades. They were allies. They were working together towards the same ends. And that informs the later decision making. With Gurgutch and Obold and everything else, eventually Raynor Battlehammer makes peace with Obold. They sign a pact that will effectively acknowledge that Many Arrows is its own kingdom. And the dwarves are uneasy about it. The humans are uneasy but willing to engage with it. And the dwarves of Mithril Hall, the kingdom of Raynor Battlehammer, those dwarves have a surface route from their mines to the human trade cities. And so they at least have something, a neutral point in that battle, in that war. They didn't lose their kingdom, but they didn't protect the human villages in the area. There are thousands of refugees, so it's somewhat of a moral loss, but it is a moral victory in a way as well. So that is, for the most part, the Orc King, and the epilogue kind of ends with those two original elves, Drizzt Do'Urden and his elf ally, saying, you know, we made that risk. Like, how did that risk turn out? Well, you can ask the dark elf that was captured and given some leeway, some freedom. You can ask him when you come back to our elven communities in the woods. And so it's a book about forgiveness, or at least giving others a chance. And in a setting, in a system like Dungeons and Dragons, where intelligent creatures may not necessarily be inherently evil at their core, they are raised to be malicious towards others, and that this book isn't, it's not great realistically, it's kind of tacky, but within the context of the setting, this is them taking a chance and investing a lot in that chance, and eventually they see that it is good. It encouraged me to buy the other books. This was the transition from 3rd edition lore into 4th edition lore, with the 3rd book in the King trilogy, the trilogy being the Orc King, the Pirate King, and the, I want to say it's either the Lich King or the Dragon King. It brings the world of Drizzt Do'Urden into the setting of 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons Forgotten Realms. And I really liked 4th edition, so it brings this character that I do like into the edition's setting that I like as well. So I found it interesting, though it wasn't the greatest of books. It was cheap, it was easy to read, and it was fun. And that's about it. It's not anything phenomenal. But yeah, I bought this for who knows how many dollars ages ago at a Goodwill in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. If you see this book used, I would encourage you to pick it up. I don't think I would buy it new, but I bought it used and I enjoyed it. My name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.